My task for this conference has been kindly urged upon me by the organizers. I need to report on the state of the art of queer studies in the Philippines today. I did not choose this as a topic, and I don't think I'd have chosen it if given a choice. It smacks not so much of something repertorial as of something magisterial, inaugural, and ceremoniously space-clearing. While it's an entirely sensible idea, especially given the fact that this is the very first national conference of its kind, I suppose I'm simply loath to take on the immense responsibility of articulating the nature and context of this thing that we are being asked to call queer studies. The reason for my misgivings about such a task will therefore be the crux of my presentation. What exactly is queer, and what is queer studies, and what are the conditions of their possibility? Are these conditions even present, or at least present enough in the Philippines so that these discourses can actually happen or take root here? What are the characteristics of these happenings, and how meaningful can they be in our case? What, if queer studies per se isn't entirely likely or feasible, can possibly take its place? How may we characterize and explain what's currently taking place in our country? Mobilizings, organizings, cultural events, such as what we're having today and in the next couple of days, knowledge production in general, that is increasingly taking place under the banner LGBTQ or LGBTQI+. How is this contemporary reality related to similar sounding events from the recent past? The 1990s, for example, when LGBT activist work started to pick up in the urban centers of our country. Allow me to begin with a personal reckoning, since I suspect this will provide a framework for historicizing our topic. In other words, inasmuch as I've been doing extensive work in this area, mostly academic and scholarly, but also communitarian and activist, recalling several key moments in this ongoing project will hopefully prove useful in taking stock of where things stand and of where we stand in relation to the topic at hand. Back in the early 1990s, when I was doing my MA thesis in comparative literature on the history of Philippine gay culture from the post-war era up until that point in time, the newfangled coalitional identity called LGBT was only starting to take shape and get invoked locally. As spurred by the separation of lesbian-identifying feminists from the broader women's movement in the country, as well as by what at the time was an entirely lethal HIV/AIDS emergency, for which international funding was generously available, that enabled grassroots organizing among members of Metro Manila's gay and MSM communities, this identity started becoming embraced as a form of political self-identification by more and more individuals in the activist movement, one of whose primary initiatives involved lobbying for anti-discrimination legislation. As we know, 3 decades in, this initiative still hasn't seen any fruition, even as the texts of the bills that have been pushed in successive congressional sessions will show the elaboration and expansion of the discourse, with more and more letters getting tacked onto the acronym under which it has hitherto been championed, from LGBT to LGBTQ to LGBTQI to LGBTQIA+. This thickening of the activist alphabet soup is of course entirely in keeping with what has also been happening in the international scene, particularly in the US. On the other hand, in my own regional engagements in the field of gender and sexuality studies, I've noticed that it was initially only the economically prosperous country of Taiwan, later followed by Singapore, that saw the word queer being referenced in both academic and activist work. This was largely due to the fact that, in the 1990s, so many young locals were receiving their degrees in the US, where they picked up the term and its attendant soji discourse, and upon returning promoted its use, even if this did not necessarily reflect what was happening on the ground. At a huge gathering of scholars in Bangkok 15 years ago, I remember that I was the one who controversially called attention to this fact during a plenary roundtable discussion in which I echoed the sentiment of so many other participants, mostly from the greater part of Asia, in particular South and Southeast Asia. This was 2004 already, and as against what would appear to be the theoretical common sense, and let's face it, globalist essentialism implicit in the keynotes and plenaries of invited speakers from the US and Australia, most local scholars participating in that conference agreed that if LGBT itself seemed far from self-evident and empirically true in our different locations in the world, what more this innovative new Anglocentrism called queer? I remember saying that during this time in the Philippines, only politically minded visiting PhilAms from the West and East Coasts would conceivably go around the archipelago referring to themselves as queer, and that they would revert to being gay or lesbian after around a week or two of hanging out in Malate or Makati with their Filipino lesbian and gay, actually more likely tibo and bakla friends. What again is queer anyway? At this point, it might be useful to do a review of this category's recent social history. As those who are ancient enough among us might recall, the currency of the term queer owes something from the AIDS crisis of the 1990s, when young gay people in the US, scared of the AIDS-identified label gay, opted to call themselves queer instead. Obviously, the increased homophobia this crisis spawned warranted a renewed militancy among gays and later on lesbians. Publicly, queer was mobilized to serve AIDS activism throughout this decade, for it referred to an identity that did not necessarily crystallize into an easily identifiable type of sexual subject. As theorized almost concurrently, queer doesn't refer to anything or anybody in particular, which is why it has proven desirable to post-identitarian critics. Back then, it was being touted among theory circles as an ambiguous category that described non- or anti-conformity. According to the theorists who promoted its use, queer can refer to any form and manner of sexual strangeness, bisexual, transgender, even straight. Supposedly, it only vaguely alludes to homosexuality and instead evokes, according to Ellis Hansen, a whole spectrum of sexual possibilities that challenge the familiar distinction between normal and pathological, straight and gay, masculine men and feminine women. All told, the arrival of queer discourse into the scene of sexual and gender theorizing in the West has been taken to signal a disruption of all conventional understandings of identity, subjectivity, political action, and community. As a critical persuasion, it is heir to the decades-long post-structuralist theorizing and social mobilization that sought to denaturalize the various categories of selfhood and desire. The idea of it is that since it cannot be defined exactly, it will stubbornly resist any and all forms of normativizing. Back in the mid-1990s, my sense about all this was, as I actually wrote in an essay titled The Queer and the Bakla, despite their similarity as refunction pejoratives that can also pertain to extra-sexual things, the most crucial difference between the two lies in the epistemologies that generated them. Postmodern on one hand, post-colonial on the other. As postmodern, the politics of queerness emerges from an anti-humanist notion of subjectivity that decenters and disperses it. As such, its performative force tends to be, in the words of the critic Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick, universalizing, in that it potentially implicates everyone being a relational category that is the constitutive other of dominant gender and sexual norms. In other words, queer is what heteronormativity precludes that makes it possible to begin with. By contrast, as post-colonial, kabaklaan is heir to models of gendered subjectivity that have an immemorial history in our islands and that have been syncretized across the colonial and post-colonial centuries. It was originally, and is still enduringly, a predominantly gender concept that bespeaks a kind of psycho-spiritual depth, of being woman-hearted, or having a feminine kalooban on one hand, and in terms of sexual desire, of being masculine-fixated, otherwise described in the literature as being slavishly fascinated with a real man or tunay na lalaki on the other. As we know, so many years later, we have seen enough local mainstreaming of the queer word in our country that a conference like this can be so confidently named. This was something I actually anticipated in that aforesaid essay. Allow me at this point to quote from it. I foresee that within the next few years, a version of queer politics will find its way into the urban sexual cultures of our country. This is bound to happen, as proven by the increasingly Western-inspired nature and context of the conceptual history of Philippine sexuality itself. As of yet, I do not know of any reasons why such an importation should fare any better than the other concepts which have already been implanted here in the last few decades or so. In my study, I referred to this as a process of appropriation, of miscomprehension and cognitive slippage. Concepts from the West do not become understood all that fully hereabouts, and although they may appear to be circulating within much of local discourse, in that the actual words are being spoken and written within the different registers of our cultures, their significations slip helplessly away from their actual performances. This situation redounds to what many critics have observed as the uncanny ability of our cultures to resist implantation of concepts for which they do not have equivalents." Unquote. I have reflected on this slippage or non-convergence in many other places and using a variety of analytic lenses across the years. More specifically, I have referred to this as the deployment of a social constructionist approach to the study of gender, sexuality, and subjectivity itself. As I understand it, and going by my own experience, the genealogy for this approach stretches from social theory to cultural studies, and from feminist anthropology to indigenous psychology. Recently, I have found that the best way to at once complicate and clarify it is by situating it within the question of interlingual cross-coding, which we may also call translation. In explaining this translational perspective, we must of course begin with the obvious, which is the grounding assumption that visibly organizes most of our discursivities, including those that this conference itself is visibly sponsoring. LGBT discourse is being conducted in the Anglophonic register in many places around the world, which is a fact that merely reflects trends in technological and cultural globalization as a whole. Let us ask ourselves the most logical question, hence. What does it mean when we render opaque the cultural specificity of the language in which we have been inquiring, especially when the location in which it occurs and to which it pertains is not monolingual or monocultural, but rather culturally hybrid, syncretic, and helplessly mixed? Because I'm also a teacher of Philippine literature in English, as well as an Anglophone creative writer of both poetry and non-fiction prose, I suppose it makes sense that I should eventually bring up this question, the linguistic situation in our country being inescapably translational, by which I mean that it is constitutively and interlingually mixed. I have come to see, reflecting on the ground on which I have been standing in all these years as a writer, scholar, and teacher at the Department of English and Comparative Literature, that to write in English in the Philippines is to engage in cultural translation, which necessitates both mimesis or representation and poiesis or invention, the resultant text being mostly a hybrid of both and therefore finally irreducible to either. This first realization quickly led to a second one. Something is always lost, something is always gained in the translational exchange, equivalency being an illusion. The translation practices can either dissimulate or visibly flag. Practically speaking, a translation can either foreignize or domesticize the target text. The latter approach aims to read seamlessly in the target language, while the former seeks to disrupt linguistic uniformity by allowing for the intrusion of the local and the untranslatable into the resultant articulation. Needless to say, at this point in my reflection, it easily dawned on me that, for the sake of uniformity and what I believed would be a kind of general intelligibility, as well as by force of habit and obligation, given that my profession in our esteemed university is as an English teacher, in practically all my English writings, I had mostly been opting to domesticize rather than foreignize my descriptions and narrations of and ruminations on local realities. Allow me to say at this point that I don't think critical Anglophone writing, even or especially in LGBTQ academic discourses in the Philippines and conceivably elsewhere, registers enough awareness of this translational process, as can be seen, for example, in their marked preference for uniformly English articulations. We need to acknowledge that English is a language that still continues to occupy an ironic or at least self-conscious place in the lives of many Filipinos, despite the fact that we already have our own Anglophone world, as attested to by our century-old literary tradition in English. Orality is immemorial in the archipelago, while literacy, which remains uneven and in many ways problematic in our own time, is coextensive with the introduction of American-style public education and the language in which it has been couched. The Philippines' Anglophone tradition represents local realities by translating them, both in the technical and cultural senses of the word. As translational, Philippine literature in English negotiates the plurality of cultural and linguistic registers and ideas of local realities, and encodes them in/as English. As my work itself all too typically exemplifies, this encoding tends to be more domesticizing than foreignizing, meaning, rather than code shift and ethnicize my use of English, I, as a typical Filipino Anglophone writer, generally tend to prefer the universal over the particular, opting for a uniformly sounding English articulation whose referential specificity inheres not so much in the actual text as in the context in which it is produced and consumed. As a consequence of this translation practice, to my mind, one of the most crucial tasks of the critic of Philippine literature in English is to post-colonially interpret its seemingly universal and self-evident themes, images, and gestures by translating them back into the specific conditions and situations that generated them. Because most Filipino writers in English prefer to compose their sentences in standard and readily intelligible ways, critics, wishing to fully make sense of their utterances, are compelled to carry out the extra textual labor of contextualizing, which will flesh out more fully the meaning of those utterances. Of course, these same critics should recognize the fact that any Anglophone translational project represents local realities only partially. Needless to say, the local will resist becoming entirely converted and will persist. In other words, invention or poesis itself puts translation's mimetic claim into crisis. What I wish to underscore at this point is the difference between creative writing and criticism. While this post-colonial reclaiming is something that we as critics are expected to perform for literary or creative texts in order to elucidate them, The question we can ask is if critical or broadly interventional texts are or should be entitled to the same kind of generosity. My sense is that critical interventions, unlike literary or creative writing, are by definition supposed to be more self-reflexive, particularly in regard to their presuppositions. Thus, while Anglophone creative writers are not expected to be all that conscious that they are performing cultural translations when they write, this very same indulgence may not be so readily granted the Anglophone critic or theorist, one of whose primary tasks is to examine his or her own logical premises when he or she writes. How do we become more aware and register the awareness of the semantic and therefore cultural transactions that are entailed by our use of English as a medium of cultural analysis in our various Anglophonic contexts? How do we pursue translation's mimetic imperative in the gendered sense when writing in English compels us to, for example, dualize gender identities and concepts, whereas in many locations in our region of the world, languages are not even pronominally gendered to begin with? An all too crucial case in point. An immense irony or slippage takes place when one translates the Tagalog pronoun siya into either he or she. How realistic can our verbal representation of our people's social relations be when we split them into the grammatical male and female pronouns, even when we fully well know that this isn't how they themselves refer to each other in their speech? We need to recognize the fact that despite the anatomical dimorphism of modern biomedicine on which the homo-hetero binary rests, as translated into the Philippine linguistic context, this binary is far from coherent and simplistically assured. While native Filipino cultures recognize the man-woman duality, this duality is not ontologized to the degree that it is in the West, in which language itself, long technologized into script and archived millennially into books, founds and promotes the opposition, whose subsequent biomedicalization has simply served to discursively solidify it all the more. This corporeal binarism is, as we know, what premises the sexological thinking that in the history of Western sexuality gave birth to such taxonomical categories as homo-hetero and to the transgressive politics that this pathologizing subsequently spurred as embodied in the categories gay, lesbian, bi, trans, and queer itself. Obviously, recognizing the translational character of gender and sexuality studies, of LGBTQ work in our various Anglophonic contexts requires the rejection of the universalist accounts of Western biomedicine. However, it entails something more. The interlingual position urges us to adopt a moderate nativist perspective in our critical interventions that bids us not only to critique essentialism, but also to always cite or locate our analyses, as well as consider the persistence of residual indigenous valuations of gender that modify, that is to say, syncretize, any newly implanted gender or sexual order. In the Philippines today, bakla signifies a syncretic notion that incorporates both local and translocal conceptions of gender transitivity and homo or same sexuality. Despite the modernizing ideologies of gender and sexuality that have been implanted in our culture through the imposition of Anglophonic education, bakla continues to preserve within itself residues of its pre-homosexual past. For instance, the notion that kabaklaan is simply a matter of confusion and indecisiveness, which are in the first place the oldest and even strictly genderless denotations of the word bakla. Just like the literacy on which it is premised, the sexualization of the Philippines has, in other words, been far from unproblematic or complete, and local valuations of gender have simply served to hybridize the newly implanted sexual order. What this stubborn genderization of concepts of sexuality tells us is that the sexualization of Filipinos, while increasing and expanding in its virulence, has thus far not been entirely uniform or complete. Suffice it to say that a century of literacy training and sexologization has not wiped out our customary and immemorial understandings of gendered identity, especially among the great masses of our people, whose education has not been very thorough, profound, and/or Anglophone. In other words, hereabouts, the more intensely literate, educated, Western-trained, English-speaking, urban, cosmopolitan, and upwardly mobile you are, the more homo-hetero you consequently become, which is to say, the more homo-hetero you consider yourself to be. While homo-hetero, gay, straight, bi, lesbian, etc. do circulate as terms that many of us identify with, we must remember that, in many cases, we understand these words translationally, which is to say, qualitatively different from their original denotations. In most cases, homo or gay is understood by us as being the same as bakla, womanish or binabae, while hetero is conflated with the real man. My sense is that here, as in many other parts of Asia, modern and contemporary discourses of gender and sexuality have not amounted to a complete supersession of their culture's existing categories for gendered personhood, but simply demonstrates the same kind of translation/hybridization that extraneous concepts necessarily undergo the moment they find currency in a particular setting. What this means is that, for example, in the Philippines, narratives of kabaklaan continue to remain as a common ground across the gay, bisexual, and male-to-female transgender identities that must now increasingly emerge from the new global discourse of LGBTQ politics. Eager as we are to jettison the bakla in favor of these Anglophone categories, if we are serious and responsible as scholars and critics of our culture's gender and sexual understandings, and if we are citing our work firmly in our local communities, we need to get real and recognize the fact that for the lives of the subjects we are studying, the unfinished cultural history of kabaklaan remains a formative, affective, and life-determining force. While the translatedness of LGBTQ critical and political discursivities in the Philippines is something the Filipino LGBTQs themselves may not be conscious about, it makes sense to suggest that they should study this cultural transformation more self-consciously, if only to have some say in its possible directions and deployments. On the other hand, on a more practical note, Anglophone critics working in LGBTQ academic and even activist discourse may need to heed the lesson coming out of the experience of many Philippine Anglophone writers whose domesticized and universal-sounding translations require critical elucidation and critical retranslation in order to be properly explained and rendered more fully culturally grounded and intelligible. Because we as critics are supposed to be more self-reflexive in our work, we should flag in our very utterance the reality of the translational labor that we are carrying out, not only by limning the specificities of the Anglophone context we are coming from and working in, but also by indicating and performing these contexts in the very texts that we are producing. Other than attend to the problems of interlingual translation across the languages of English and our many native tongues, we of course also need to think about the intersemiotic translation across orality and textuality, which is a cultural transition that remains uneven and unfinished in our case. I have already referred to this when I earlier mentioned the gendered non-dualism inherent in our language's pronominal system. This is a non-dualism that grounds all vernacular utterances by Filipinos, and so you can only imagine what it implies, and why global debates about pronouns within the trans, queer, and non-binary communities must remain quaint for most Filipinos living in the Philippines. It's interesting but telling, for instance, that the audibly Phil-Am-specific problem of Filipinx didn't quite catch on among social media users in the Philippines. Do allow me at this point to share with you what I believe to be germane insights, which I have gleaned from my reading of the Sugidanon. These are transcribed chanted epics that come from the Panay Bukidnon people, the complete corpus of which the UP Press, of which I am the director, is currently in the process of publishing. Epics are a form of myth, and their basic theme, as with all myths, is that there is an invisible reality that supports the visible world. Mythology in this sense is fundamentally mystical in character, rendering into images the amorphous essence of all things through which it can be experienced and known. We may then see myth as a creative and imaginative field whose referent in the ultimate sense is transcendent. Its purpose is to enable us to experience the world that opens to us the spiritual dimension that enfolds it. Myths make us realize the mystical presence in everyone and in everything, for according to their deepest insight, we have all been poured out of the Creator's eternal self. We are all manifestations of the one divinity. But mythology also evinces other functions. Like science, myth describes for us the various shapes and textures of reality. Unlike science, however, it more easily accedes to the realization that what is real is ultimately unknowable. And then we may also say that myths serve a didactic or pedagogical purpose as well. They provide individuals residing in their specific communities guides or manuals on how to live under whatever conditions. Finally, myth also serves to legitimate the social order as it exists. It's in this sense that myths are culturally bound as well as place-specific. They are entirely the products of their own time and circumstance. The problem of literalism is precisely its reduction of myths to this literal level, this sociological function, to the neglect of the rest. The functions of myth are in full evidence in the Sugidanon, which are descriptive not so much of the Panay Bukidnon's ancient world as expressive of their abiding aspirations. Chiefest of these is the vision that not only recognizes duality, but also, and more importantly, yearns to transcend it. Indeed, in these ancestral stories, the sky world and the earth world are not divided, but actually interpenetrate one another, their creatures freely trafficking across the non-absolute and proximal realms of the present and the non-present, either the past or the yet-to-be, as well as the abode of the deities and supernatural forces. Resurrection is a passageway between the chasm of the living and the dead, and it happens often enough in these stories. Very significantly, as the Sugidanon's different books aver, even the distinctions of gender and enmity prove to be mutable, traversable. Femaleness shifts into maleness if it must, as the sorceress heroines Matanayon and Malitong Yawa both do, transforming themselves into gallant datus in their respective adventures in order to fight for their own dignity against the covetous usurper. And the enemy or the other is actually inextricably part of this familiar or the same, is shockingly its blood relation, if you only allow yourself to look more closely. Finally, evil can be good, too, once you intuit past the surface of the apparent into the hidden and implicit depth. In like manner, there's really no conflict between the body and the spirit, as can be intuited from the way these stories perceive and present the truth of human sexuality, namely, that it is nature's entirely beautiful, indeed its precious and altogether golden, gift. This last insight is embodied so clearly in the series' second book, in which the cave-dwelling monster villainess Amburukai sets out to recover her golden pubic hair, which the thieving hero Labaudongon had plucked from her sleeping body, to use as a replacement cord in his beloved heirloom Kudyapi. As this epic would have it, throughout her story, Amburukai must engage in her own heroic journey, characterized by an interesting ritual of humorous, if slightly masochistic, self-intimacy. For 10 successive mornings, she squats on a rock by the river delta and ceremoniously slaps her vulva, which is supposed to produce a certain sound in avid response if the stolen hair is indeed located somewhere up that particular waterway. It may be difficult to imagine this now from our perspective as Christianized and sexually anxious lowlanders, but yes, in our archipelago there was a time back when we were all lumad, when genital matters could indeed be described so openly and funnily in the chanted epics and tales that carried communal wisdom and functioned as the primary means of entertainment. What's important to realize here is that this singular piece of pubic hair embodies the pre-Christian idea of an entirely natural and precious sexuality. For the Panay Bukidnon, anything golden or bulawan is superlative and perfect, and the fact that they could imagine pudendal hair in these terms reveals to us not only the complete absence of erotophobia, but also their society's deep affirmation of female being, including, if not especially, female sexuality, embodied in the complex and paradoxical character of a she-monster who proves herself morally superior to the hero and undergoes her own heroic quest, and who is, in truth, as the book would finally reveal, a kind and benevolent mother to her two adopted daughters. Perhaps the most interesting idea in these epics is that of the tuos or sacred pact, which is a crucial element in these heroic tales that propel their plots forward. Pacts are embodied in this pre-literate world, not in any written contract, but rather in actual tangible things that are thereby invested with spiritual potency and incalculable worth. In one book, it's a bell-topped bamboo. In another, it's a gold pendant. In the absence of writing and the kind of categorical mentality it occasions, this ancient and oral people found a way of signifying and pinning down memory through the worldly and yes, ungendered objects that signified beyond their physical forms and whose radiance suffused their everyday reality. Most certainly, the act of investing meaning into their world was of a piece with this people's reverential attitude toward nature, that they knew was animated by the same spirit dwelling inside themselves. Given this form of mystical mnemonics, we are reminded of the psychodynamics of oral consciousness, which is situational, sympathetic, and participatory, rather than abstract and individualistic. As opposed to being categorically absolute, oral thinking is immediate, practical, close to the life world, and at once copious and voluble. Of course, what these self-same qualities tell us is that oral cultures are living and dynamic social formations in their own right. Despite being non-dualistic and in that sense pre-analytical, orality is a mode of consciousness that is eminently capable of generating as well as nurturing its own profound forms of thought. It describes a kind of subjectivity that is shared rather than solipsistic, and that commits itself to complex or paradoxical forms of action and thought that apprehends disparities and dualities and seeks to embrace them both. Recalling our people's oralities, we can see that the insight of harmony and non-duality, of humanity and nature, the worldly and the divine, the male and the female, the light and the dark, the self and the other, remains a priceless and important bequest especially now that we are seeing many of these stories and epics becoming transcribed, textualized, and translated, and therefore becoming newly abstract and categorical for our own time. In the face of a fractious and divided country, and of a fractious and divided world presently caught in the grip of an enormous public health crisis, these are insights that can only urge us toward more and more empathy. These are ideals that we all need to embrace and to champion more and more. This tangent discussion of the Sugilanon and orality has a point, and it has very little to do with nativist nostalgia, even as this may be a propitious side effect. In the main, I would like to encourage all of us who are working on gender and sexuality studies in our country to pay attention to how persistent and unfinished is the regime of folk or oral thinking in our respective fields of study, and to consider how, because of it, we may need to more carefully recalibrate and modulate, which is to say translate, our literacy-based assumptions and categories, and even the methodologies that they imply. If the male-female dualism is not structurally ontologized among our people on the level of language, which is to say on the level of thought, and if we are not entirely burdened by the biomedical history of anatomized dimorphism, then how may we reimagine our queer and trans politics? How much more realistic would our research and writings be if, alongside or within our use of a pronominally gendered English, we have our own gender unitarian local languages to invoke, tap, mobilize, and radicalize in order not only to report on how things are, but also to gesture toward how things should be? In the spirit of non-duality and simultaneity, why can't the self-identifying trans, gay, bi, lesbian, or queer among us also in the same breath be confidently and unapologetically bakla, bayot, bantut, tibo, or agi, especially if we in fact have passed through headily vernacular childhoods in our own corners of this country of all our difficult affections. In sympathy with this call to think in complex and paradoxical ways, bakit di tayo mag-code shift when needed, especially since ang situation naman na nakararami sa ating mga Becks at Tibs is bi or multilingual? Bakit di natin pag-aralan ang heteronormativity at busisiin ng maigi if there is only one heteronormativity or if there are many? Kasi feel ko na aside from heteronormativity proper, which is Western, literacy-based, and biomedical, and which is the matrix that feminists like Judith Butler have already expertly unpacked, meron ding mga other heteronormativities, all under quotes, kasi di naman tayo sure kung dapat nga silang tawaging that way. Feeling ko, merong versions of the male-female dichotomy in other cultures na di naman heteronormative when you think more deeply about them, because their distinction between two structural genders is customary and not binary, complementary and not oppositional, their performative force oral provisional rather than scriptural absolute. Feel ko lang these are the heteronormativities na maaari nating i-claim at i-queer, using our own self-consciously translational languages. We can come up with a more nuanced and locally responsive trans theory, for example, when we begin with an examination of our own hybrid heteronormativity, in which, owing to orality psychodynamics, the difference between man and woman is not necessarily chasmic, somatically self-evident and inarguable, but rather always already navigable and negotiable through a native oral discourse of gendered interiority, which has a way of nuancing and qualifying embodiment, and whose plenitude permits the possibility of gender complexity that isn't, and this is important, the same thing as transgenderism, since it is not premised on biomedical dimorphism and all its treatment implications. Think of the richly generative idea of kalooban with its 200-something derivatives on one hand, and on the other, consider what the Unitarian quality of our languages is telling us. Since there is no verbal and therefore cognitive marker for male and female persons in our pronominal speech, in our case, there may be no ontological gender barrier or boundary to transit or transition across at all. Imagine how liberating and egalitarian this kind of trans perspective might be, inasmuch as it relocates the issue of gendered personal realization away from the pharmacotherapeutic and medico-surgical, which always already implicates class, by the way, towards something more accessible, expressive, creative, affective, possibly spiritual and democratic, something deeply personal and communal, all at once. Trans activism in the West has sought to counter biologism with psychologism, forgetting both are simply obverse sides of the same biomedically heteronormative coin. By contrast, if we are to insist on the affordances for gender expression implicit in our native discourses of personal and communal depth and in our gender Unitarian languages, we will not be falling into the same sexological trap and will locate possibilities for gendered embodiments that derive from the richness of our own cultural heritage. We are not unique in this. Many other non-Western cultures have their own non-biomedical trans traditions to draw from, for instance in India and Nepal and among indigenous Americans. In a recent interview, Butler once again reminds us that gender is not an essence, but rather, and I quote, a historical category, and we do not yet know all the ways it may come to signify, and we are open to new understandings of its social meanings, unquote. It is time we remember, inquire into, and celebrate our culture's own old and evolving gender significations, respecting and hailing their specificities without mindlessly subsuming them into easy, global-sounding identities and terms whose histories are not really our own. In line with this thought and in parting, allow me to reflect on queer once more, but this time in a different grammatical sense. As a transitive verb, queer has been understood as a strategy of reading and interpretation that seeks to surface the dissonances and incoherencies of both traditional and oppositional genders and sexualities, in order to trouble their univocal claims that oversimplify and reduce what are irrefutably complex and shifting realities and truths of personal and collective being and becoming. As used in the reading of cultural texts, hence, to queer may be taken in the same spirit as to deconstruct, with a view of pursuing different strands of anti-erotophobic critique in the project of textual interpretation. It is precisely with this idea in mind of critical self-interrogation or deconstruction that I have chosen to subtitle my keynote, Queering the Queer. By pointing out the queer signifier's translational fate in Anglophone worlds outside the US and Australia, in particular in our culturally and linguistically diverse country, in which traditional models of subjectivity, even if only residually, persist, and in which the biomedical and hence literacy-based dimorphism underpinning sexological thinking and Western heteronormativity continues to be confounded by lingering oral forms of non-dualist gender ideology, I am inviting us all, scholars in our respective fields of inquiry, in this, the very first conference of its kind sponsored by no less than our country's one and only national university, to, in the words of national artist Franz Arceliana, get real. And so, yes, mga fellow mamshies and popshies, it's time to gently nudge or slap ourselves awake from the uniform English sentences we have been all too blissfully, all too obliviously, all too neocolonially dreaming in. Let us all queer the queer by disrupting its monolingual narratives and by revoking its monocultural assumptions. Let this conference indeed be the first of its kind. In keeping with the signifier's originally transgressive and anti-normative energy, in our own social advocacies for equality, tsugiin natin ang mga ilusyon natin tungkol sa queer globality, and let us take every care to localize and specify our use of this and all the other allied words of our profession and vocation, to make them carry the weight of our situatedness, of our circumstances, of our dreams. Gawin natin silang mga sisidlan ng ating mga buhay as we actually, complexly, syncretically, and deliriously live them. Let us use the tools the translators have when they translate on one hand, and on the other, as with all other global interpretations, let us mobilize the queer in our work as a self-reflexive and contested term with enabling but entirely provisional and heuristic properties. Allow me to leave you all with an image of two Ifugao Bulol figures, male and female rice deities, sculpted anonymously in the Cordillera sometime in the 1800s. Notice how formally synchronous and complementary they are, their duality recognized yet transfigured, pared down and sublimed humbly away. While colonialism and its hierarchies are, even if largely as translations, already with us, while our linguistic and cultural worlds are becoming more and more layered and mixed, and while we all must live in our own time, our hope is that we may still be able to hold on to and be inspired by what tenaciously endures about our identities as post-colonial subjects, which our many spoken languages still, thankfully, allow us to remember. Even as our embodied differences constitute everyday truths about who we are, as our ancestors understood all too clearly, underlying these truths, superseding these differences, is the inner oneness of our common humanity, which is also our common divinity. A pleasant day to everyone. Here's to a meaningful and hopefully finally grounded and real conference. Thank you.